7 missed deadlines later, they're still at the bargaining table in Vienna, nerves tested on this day 17 of nuclear negotiations, with at one point the Chinese foreign minister calling for no more delays in the marathon talks. Well, it's going to be a day 18 at least, we know that much. The stakes are enormous. Iran's nuclear ambitions put on a leash in exchange for the gradual lifting of UN sanctions, the opening up of a market of nearly 80 million to the West, and a possible review of old alliances will gauge the reactions from Iran's regional rivals, Israel and Saudi Arabia, and look at just how close we are to a deal. This in the France 24 debate. Joining us from Vienna in a short while, Reza Marashi, Research Director at the National Iranian American Council. From Washington, let's say hello to Robert Satloff, Executive Director of the Washington Institute. Thank you for being with us.
It's a pleasure to be here.
And in the studio with us, attorney and political commentator Ardavan Amir Aslani. Welcome back, sir.
Thank you for having me.
The problem now, what's the stumbling block here? It seemed as though at one point we might have had a deal today.
You mentioned it. You've got all these people hanging around in Vienna for 17 consecutive days. The United States Secretary of State is in Vienna for 17 consecutive days. He spent more time with the Iranian Foreign Minister than with any other Foreign Minister of any other country. It is impossible that they can afford the political risk of going back to the respective countries without an agreement, without clinching an agreement. I believe that an agreement has been reached, and now we're dealing with the technicalities, with the drafting issues. We're talking about a document that is 100 pages long, with dozens of pages of technical annexes. It's going to take time. I don't think it's going to go beyond tomorrow, but it's going to happen.
Robert Satloff, do you agree that there probably already is a deal?
Well, I think there's probably a deal. I don't agree that neither side could go home without an agreement. If John Kerry came home and said the Iranians were simply intransigent, most Americans would shrug and say that's the way they are. I think what is probably holding up the deal, in addition to the technicalities that your guest mentioned, is the Iranians are still testing to see if there's one more concession, one more small marginal gain they can get at the very end of the negotiations. And only when they know that the Secretary of State is about to board a plane are they likely to finally close the deal.
So he should, pack his bags? That's what will seal the agreement?
I think privately he should probably indicate to the Iranians that there is indeed a limit here. And he doesn't have to make big public declarations. That's not the way these things are accomplished. But the Iranians need to know that there is an end game here. And if they want the deal that's on the table, they're most likely need to take it.
All the parties have spent their time flexing their muscles. Last Thursday, the U.S. Secretary of State came out and said that he may actually leave the negotiating table and go back to D.C. Zarif, the Iranian foreign minister, he himself, went out with the famous hashtag, "Don't threaten an Iranian." All the strategies, negotiating themes have been utilized by everyone. The time and the hour of truth has arrived, and I believe that the Iranians have reached a position whereby they know that the deal is out there and the time is there for them to grab it and take it. They cannot afford themselves to go back to Tehran without a deal. You've got an entire nation that is waiting for the positive news of this deal coming out to them and them ending nearly 4 decades of horrendous economic sanctions that have been annihilating the Iranian economy and raising havoc locally.
All right, let's cross now to Vienna and Reza Marashi of the National Iranian American Council. Reza, how do you feel about the prospect of day 18 of hotel food?
For me, it's day 21. Unfortunately, it hasn't entirely been hotel food. I've had the opportunity to try some great restaurants since I've been here in Vienna. But look, in all seriousness, the reality of the situation is that both of your guests highlight the maximalist positions that fortunately have been abandoned here in Vienna. The reality of the situation here on the ground is that both sides, it is crystallized in their minds that they either win together or they lose together. Of course there's going to be last-minute brinkmanship. No, Robert, not just by the Iranian side. It's going to happen on the American side and the P5+1 side as well, because that's how negotiations work. But as you drive those two cars towards the end of the cliff, do we really think that one side or the other side is going to drive the car off the end of the cliff? Or are they going to pump the brakes, let cooler heads prevail, and secure a deal that is in the national interest of both sides? I think all rational people can agree that the latter scenario is the most likely one to prevail. It's not a matter of if, It's a matter of when.
So, Reza, what is the last stumbling block, or blocks, plural?
Oh, I'm glad you asked me. That's a great question. First and foremost, this is a 100-page document that's being written in 2 different languages. So the expectation that that could be done in relatively short notice or relatively quickly, I think is unfair. They're not on page 1, but they're not on page 99. So this takes time. Also, we have to remember there are lawyers that are well-versed in international law and UN Security Council resolutions, literally rewriting the way that Chapter 7 resolutions work, meaning usually when countries are referred to the UN Security Council, they end up getting bombed. This is going to be the first instance, fortunately, where that doesn't happen. I would hope that most of the guests that are on this show with me can agree that a negotiated solution is better than a war that both sides would independently seek to avoid. And third, and perhaps least mentioned, is of course there's going to be some last-minute horse trading. You give me this, I'll give you that. Issues that are mostly closed, but not entirely closed, because again, that's the way that negotiations have a propensity to work. So if you take all 3 of these things wrapped into one, that's why we're here for 21 days.
Does that explain, for instance, the fact that Washington Post journalist has been, who's charged with espionage, suddenly appears in court this Monday?
I think that the example is another reprehensible one of an innocent person, in my humble opinion, Jason Rezaian, once again being attached to something that he has no business being attached to. He was an accredited journalist in Iran when he was put in prison, and he should be freed immediately. And I do think that his case and his imprisonment continues to be tied to these negotiations, and the Iranian government should release him before the negotiations come to a conclusion, and it's my hope that it will happen, if not before, then immediately after.
All right, after an agreement, of course, there's a second battle for the Obama administration, the one he'll have to wage on a hostile Capitol Hill.
I think it's going to be a hard sell. He knows that the resolution of disapproval that's likely to be introduced is very likely to pass, and very likely to get over 60 votes.
Ardavan Amir-Aslani?
It's going to be tough, and that's beyond doubt. The simple fact that you reach an agreement doesn't imply that sanctions are going to go away. They will go away as far as the United Nations is concerned. They will go away as far as the European Union is concerned. However, as far as the U.S. sanctions are concerned, it's a different story. Now, because the parties didn't manage to reach an agreement by midnight, July 9th, this implies that the United States Congress now has an additional 30 days to look at the document. This means 60 days as of its signature. 60 days is a long time when you're talking about a deal of this magnitude with so much, gobbledygook around it. However, what's going to happen is the following. It will go into the U.S. Congress. There will be debate. I believe personally the Republicans have lost a great deal of credibility out there with their maximalist, extremist approach to Iran, and they have managed to estrange a number of willing Democrats. I also believe that the U.S. economy cannot afford to have the entire planet sign to the Iran deal and for them just to bulk out of it. It's impossible. If the deal goes today, the U.S. Congress will move up and down, is going to use all the means at its disposal to create some kind of a buzz around it, but the deal will go through. It's an inevitable conclusion.
Robert Satloff, do you agree?
Well, I think we should all be quite humble about using words like inevitable. I think the nature of the final concessions and agreements on a number of key items, for example, the arms embargo, Security Council resolution, the nature of inspections, the limitations on research and development, all of these are likely to trigger introspection, not just by Republicans, but by a handful of very serious national security Democrats who are wary of this deal. Is it a very high bar to overturn a decision of the president? Yes. Ultimately, there would need to be 2/3 majorities in both houses of Congress. A very difficult target for any legislative majority. Is it possible? It's possible. Is it likely? It's not likely, but I think it really ultimately will depend on the nature of the agreement, on whether it is commonly viewed to advance American interests, and what the alternatives are after everybody gets to read the final text.
And what are the alternatives, Robert Satloff?
Well, I don't think they are nearly as apocalyptic as some people suggest. The alternative to this agreement is not war. The alternative of this agreement is not a calamity. There will be no Security Council resolution approved between now and the end of our congressional review. So it is not as though Security Council sanctions will end between now and then.
So what you're suggesting is a holding pattern.
Yes, if indeed this is ultimately rejected by the 2/3 majorities of both houses, then the president will have to go back to the drawing board. This is not the end of the world. I think quite likely the Iranians will say they're going to keep their end of the bargain and they will seek to divide the P5+1, and it becomes a very serious diplomatic challenge for the United States. But this is not apocalyptic, not the end of the world.
Reza Marashi?
Well, look, the congressional battle is going to be a big one. And I think both sides, the pro-deal and anti-deal camps, are going to throw everything that they have at their respective views and opinions. This fight is going to be very similar to the fight that the White House fought on health care, where they're going to have to appeal to national interest as opposed to personal political interests of fence-sitting Democrats, because let's be honest, most Republicans aren't going to support this, even if it was flowers, rainbows, and unicorns. So look, I think he's going to be able to do it. Now, is he going to be able to do it before they overturn it? And it remains to be seen. Is he going to get it on the first try or the second try? I don't know. But I think he is going to get it because if and when the deal gets done, the details of this, what we already know after Lausanne, was fantastic. And if it's going to be in addition to what we found out in Lausanne, then this is going to be one of the best arms control agreements, not treaties, agreements that we've had in recent memory, probably since the START Treaty. And we should be intellectually honest about that. So I look forward to the opportunity to weigh this deal on its merits. And I also look forward to a more intellectually honest conversation about the alternative. Because the alternative isn't a holding pattern. The alternative is escalation and conflict that resumes rapidly if this falls apart. So that's why I think both sides are working so diligently in the building behind me to ensure that it doesn't fall apart.
This deal, of course, it's about the Iranian nuclear issue. And it's not about trusting the Iranian government. It's about implementing tools that are verifiable and that will enable the IAEA and the international community to verify that Iran is complying with all of its undertakings. However, where I disagree is the following. If this deal doesn't go through, what does that imply? This implies that we will all go back to the previous situation, the statu ante, where Iran would not be bound by any legal constraints whatsoever. It could continue its nuclear activities without any kind of a control. And furthermore, it's about the nuclear deal, but it's not only about the nuclear deal. Look at the Middle East. Look at the global situation. I mean, without any Iran, you're going to have, if there is no deal, you're going to have proliferation all across the region. Saudi Arabia has already said that no matter what, if Iran gets involved in the quest for a nuclear weapon, they're going to do the same thing. And what about this volcanic eruption of the medieval Islamic State? Who's going to stop these guys, aside from Iran and their allies?
Okay, but the Israelis making the argument in reverse.
Not the Israelis. I don't think
the Israelis are saying that the Israeli defense minister this Monday saying that the deal naturally contains implications on other states which perceive this situation as a threat, neighboring states that are talking about their need to be armed, which could start a regional nuclear armament race. Moshe Yaalon, who goes on to say, we're heading towards a bad deal, and after it, of course, we'll have to continue to preparing to protect ourselves on our own.
That's what they have been saying all along, ever since the concept and the principle of a negotiation began. So no matter what document we end up with, they're still going to criticize it. And let's remember, we're not talking about the Israelis per se. We're talking about the Likud party and the right wing of the Likud party. If I recall, Isaac Herzog, the head of the Labour Party, basically put all his trust in Obama and his negotiation skills to get a good deal out there. And this is a good deal. It is the best possible deal that we can get out in the current circumstances, and it's verifiable. It's not about trusting the Iranians. It's about guaranteeing to the Iranians their access to a civilian nuclear facility and at the same time preventing a quest for a nuclear bomb.
Which brings us back to the point that you made, Reza Marashi, hoping for an intellectual arguments that to be made when it's all brought before Congress. Our Jerusalem correspondent saying there are some in his Israeli circles who want to take their lobbying efforts directly to Congress. They haven't decided to do so yet, but they're thinking about it.
No, they've already decided to. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when. I think they've been very open about that, and senior professional staff on Capitol Hill has told me directly that AIPAC told Prime Minister's office in Israel that they don't have the votes in order to defeat this deal when it comes to Congress, and the Israeli government told AIPAC to go ahead and do the fight anyway. Now, that might be true, that might be false. I happen to believe my source. But what's indisputable is that pro-Israel groups would stop this fight now. After everything they've done in the run-up to a deal being done, that they're magically going to stop when it comes to the implementation of the deal, I find that to be far-fetched, to put it diplomatically.
All right, so Robert Satloff, how do you see the region after such a deal?
Well, there's a fascinating debate which has been going on in Washington as to whether the deal, if one occurs, will be, on the one hand, what we say is transactional, just to trade nuclear ambitions for sanctions, or transformative. Will this pave the way for a new and different Iran, a kinder, gentler Iran everywhere around the Middle East? And this debate has been crystallized in the debate about what Iran will do with its sanctions relief money. There's some who suggest that Iran has exhaustive domestic needs, infrastructure building, human capital, and that the $100 to $150 billion of sanctions relief will go to these social services, while others point out that it is quite likely that a significant chunk, small, large, a significant chunk, will go to Iran's destabilizing activities. I haven't met any serious Middle East analyst who thinks that that no money is going to go to funding the civil war in Yemen, to funding Hezbollah, to funding terrorism around the world, to funding Iranian dawah activities in Iraq, in essence, to extend Iran's political hegemonic ambitions around the Middle East. That is far more likely than the idea that Iran is going to turn into a kinder, gentler nation, certainly in the short term. In the long run, is there the potential for an evolution inside Iran? I think it's eminently possible. We saw the Green Revolution begin to take hold a few years ago, regrettably stamped out by this regime. Hopefully, over time, that's what will happen. But I think in the near run, we should all be quite realistic, or as your other guest said, to have some intellectual honesty, that billions of dollars are going to flow, for better or for worse, into the hands of some of the Middle East's most unsavory characters, and that it will be a far more unstable Middle East in the near term as a result of the sanctions relief flowing to Tehran.
Ardavan Amir-Aslani, in the near term, it'll be a more unstable region?
I believe that this Iranian president and his administration have been elected on one agenda: to be able to deliver to the Iranian people what they've been craving for. That is an end to the isolation of Iran and the return of Iran to its legitimate position in the international community. And I believe that the vast majority of these funds that will be deblocked and sent back to Iran will be utilized by the regime so as to enhance the living standards of our people who are living in dire straits. You're talking about a country of 80 million, 70% of whom are under 40, who are jobless, who need a future. Now, will some of this money go to Iranian allies across the region? Maybe. But I mean, we should also think about all the other money, going from Iran's, competitors in the area to the Islamic State, to Daesh and all the others, from Saudi Arabia and all the other petro monarchies in the Persian Gulf. I mean, look at what the Saudis are doing today. I haven't been hearing any comment out of DC questioning that. Bombing Yemen on a daily basis, 80 people being killed every day, the vast majority of them civilians. I mean, the destruction imposed upon Yemen and its cultural and historical sites it blushes with jealousy the people in Daesh who are thinking about how to destroy Palmyra. So let's not, equate Iran with all the other fanatical regimes that are in the area. It's not the case. You cannot just throw out words out there and try to isolate Iran as being the bad boy in town, which is not the case.
All right. So we're seeing on both sides there are people, unfortunately, carrying out a lot of evil acts in the region. But Reza Marashi, will there be more stability in the near term in the region as a result of a nuclear deal with Iran? Will there be a domino effect, or will this take place in a vacuum?
I think that there can be, and there very likely will be, an increased level of stability, because if nothing else, a deal will allow the U.S. and Iran to have conversations about regional security that really haven't been had in any kind of sustained fashion in over 3 decades. Now, that doesn't guarantee that those conversations can turn into stabilizing actions, but it's a heck of a lot better than the status quo. Now, what I would add in addition is that A, if Iran gets over $100 billion in sanctions relief, they're not going to get all that money all at once. That would destabilize the Iranian economy in ways that not even the Iranian government wants to take place. Two, they've already allocated the $100 billion to domestic purposes. Does it allow for the possibility that they divert it after they get it? Sure. But since they've already allocated it, since their budget is based on it, and since they've publicly pronounced it as promises to their people, it'd be pretty stupid if they actually took that money and did something else with it. And last but not least, Iran's regional strategy when it comes to military and political is largely based on asymmetric warfare. That doesn't cost a lot of money. The Saudi military budget dwarfs Iran's. The GCC military budget dwarfs Iran. Iran gets more bang for its buck because it plays the game smarter and it plays the game more viciously. And that's really what we're trying to get them to change at the end of the day. Can they change the way that they do these things? I think it's a proposition worth testing. Unfortunately, my friend in Washington doesn't sound as optimistic or as willing to give it a shot.
Robert Sadloff?
Well, that's because there's absolutely zero evidence to suggest the Iranians are even interested in changing the way they do business vis-a-vis Hezbollah or Yemen or what's going on inside Iraq or destabilizing activities anywhere.
You got to pay attention, Rob.
I
do
They've
said
pay
it very
attention.
openly that they want to have those conversations. Rob, the Supreme Leader said it. The Foreign Minister said it. The Supreme National Security Council said it. The Chief of Arab Affairs and the Foreign Ministry said it. Just because you don't want to hear it doesn't mean it wasn't said.
No, I'm sorry. But I look at what countries do, not just what leaders
Rob.
say. And the leadership of Iran is continuing to provide. Excuse me, the leadership of that's very interesting. The leadership of Iran is continuing to provide lethal weaponry around the Middle East in violation of numerous Security Council resolutions. And well, that's a very interesting comment. But the facts remain what they are.
That's the same talking
point.
Is
because.
That's the same talking point. Give peace a chance, Rob.
Listen,
that's all I'm saying.
I think when you have no leg to stand on, it's interesting to cite these sort of talking points. The reason it's interesting for you to cite
I'm
the
not
sort
promising
of
anything. I'm just saying give it a chance.
It's not a question of giving a chance. I think we should have you're the one who suggested we should have an open-eyed, realistic assessment of the situation. This deal may or may not be a way to advance our national interest. It may very well be.
Yes.
We have to assess it. But one thing that we should open our eyes to is no one should be under the illusion that the assets here are going to trigger some mellowing of Iranian behavior in Syria, in Iraq, in Yemen, or elsewhere. Quite the contrary. Now, maybe it's worth it to have limitations on the Iranian nuclear program for a period of time. Maybe that's worth it, but it is certainly not an adult, mature conversation to suggest that the Iranians are going to turn into peace-loving, kumbaya-singing partners of America in trying to instill stability throughout the region.
What we're seeing over here, one last comment, is that
the reality of the situation is I didn't say that. I said that Iran could go from an enemy to a competitor.
And what we're seeing now is the following, that the Americans and the entire planet are involved in an alliance fighting Daesh and the Islamic State. And it just happens that Iran and its allies are fighting the same people. Now we can go on and on repeating this boring, overdone argument about Iran being the center and the epicenter of all the evil in the world. At the end of the day, Iran is participating in this quest that the West has embarked upon and putting an end to this feudal, horrendous situation that we have in the Middle East. And Iran, far from being a factor causing instability, is today a guarantor of stability against what we're witnessing today. Had it not been for Iran, Erbil in Kurdistan would have been overwhelmed. Had it not been for Iran, Samarra would have been overwhelmed. Had it not been for Iran, Tigray would have never been freed. So you can go on and on, finger pointing at Iran, but the facts on the ground differ. And the facts on the ground illustrate one simple fact, that the Americans and the Iranians are involved, whether they like it or not, in the same war against the same people. And as the French Prime Minister lately pointed out, this conflict of civilization in which the Western world is involved in, it's not against Iran. It's not against even the Shia faith. It's against a certain version of Islam that is Sunni and is Wahhabi. Full stop.
All right. We'll leave it there. And of course, we'll have more time to talk about it since there is not a deal at hand yet. But I want to thank our panel, Ardavan Amir-Aslani,
Thank you.
Reza Marashi in Vienna, who's getting set for day 22 of Hotel Food, and Robert Satloff in Washington. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.